Hello there and good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. We're going to have a special edition of our weekly Q&A session with Professor Michael Clarke. As you can see, we've been joined by our International Affairs Editor, Dominic Waghorn, for what is, as I say, a special edition of this, focused on the ongoing conflict between Israel and Iran. So, Dom, welcome to our Q&A. Michael, of course, great to see you as always. Thank you for your questions that you've submitted. I am reliably told that this is the most popular Q&A that we've done, 1,500 or so questions, and perhaps more coming in as we go along. You can put them in the blogs you have done before or beneath the YouTube video as we talk. If anything occurs to you that you want our two experts to answer. All right, guys, let's get straight on with this. And I'll start with you, Michael. This is a question that we often get when we talk about the Ukraine war. This has come in from Tony. Could what we're seeing right now escalate to World War III?
No. Next question. I mean, the point is we might see a regional war out of this, and it might get difficult. And if the United States gets involved, and I guess we'll talk about that a bit later on, then it will change the relationship with Russia and China and the big three in that respect. But, you know, World War III would depend on escalation on the basis of a sort of common ideological challenge around the world. And that's not what this is. This is a regional problem, which could become very nasty. But at worst, it will be a regional war in which the great powers dabble, and perhaps dabble more than they should. But that's the worst, in my view, that it could be.
So perhaps in Tony's mind is the fact that, you know, often world wars start with a regional conflagration that then expands into something else, right?
It is the case, but you see, the First World War started because a small war, small problem, was between imperialist powers who had their empires around the world, so they fought in their empires around the world. And the Second World War started in Europe, but it was an ideologically charged war between fascism on the one hand and liberal democracy on the other. And although that got pretty murky, there were elements that united the small wars. I mean, both First and Second World Wars were actually a series of smaller wars that became universal for other reasons. This would be a nasty war, but I don't see any transmission mechanism that would make this universal. It wouldn't unite an underlying fault line in world politics between one group of big powers and another group of big powers.
You can see the fear, though, can't you? You can understand why people are deeply worried, because these pictures look apocalyptic, you know, ballistic missiles raining down on Tel Aviv, cities that some of us may have been on holiday to that look very familiar, and then what Israel is doing also to Iran. But like,
it's not a stupid question. That's the point. It's not,
no, I think it's a question at the moment, isn't it?
Exactly.
I'm being asked this all the time by friends and family as well. But I think
wars can run out of control.
It would need the other powers to get sucked in, and the impression you get. I mean, Russia has a security pact with the Iranians,
right?
And they're not honoring it. They're not getting involved.
The Russians and the Chinese are not going to come to Iran's aid.
There's nothing in it for
rhetorically. There's nothing in. Well,
rhetorically they might, and they might help in. I mean, if the Iranians were right on their knees, they might help them in a sort of logistical way. But they're not going to come in to fight for them. I'm certain about that.
I think they're happy to watch this play out, and I think the Chinese are watching it very closely to see who prevails, and that's something I think that is weighing on American planners' minds as well. You know, what kind of deterrence does America project now in this war, and its crucial next steps that the American president takes, and the Chinese will read that very closely. The only way the Russians might get involved would be sort of trying to help the Iranians by sort of, you know, in a covert way, and then being discovered. But you just can't see the Russians risking that. They've got too much going on.
I mean, the Iranians are going to feel a bit let down after supplying all those drones to the Russians and they're not getting anything back. But you're saying there's nothing in it for the Russians. It's a cynical government there. They're not going to do anything to help.
If you want gratitude in world politics, get a dog. I mean, there is no gratitude in any of this. It's hard-nosed national interest, and the Russians will not stick their necks out for the Iranians.
And the regional powers, so Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, are looking on and hoping it blows over. And I think, you know, hoping that Iran is weakened, but at the moment, it's just hoping it can de-escalate one way or another. Not getting drawn in either. So it's hard to see any power. They're just standing back and letting it play out, I think.
Tehran must feel very lonely at the moment. I think the Iranian leadership must feel really pretty isolated, actually. Because their proxies have been dismantled.
Right.
I mean, Hezbollah and Hamas, the Houthis are there, but they're just a damn nuisance, to be honest.
Have they said much? Are they going to start hitting ships again?
They might. But they're just a nuisance. They're not a strategic force. And the Iranians have got almost nobody else to turn to, and they are under real pressure. I think they must feel very lonely.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to the next question. It's from Joe Evans. and he's asking you really, guys, to kind of game this out if we can. So how high are the chances of the US getting involved? As Dom has said, there was a meeting of the cabinet yesterday where they're discussing it, and now we are told that Donald Trump is waiting to decide what he's going to do next. Now, the second part of Joe's question is, if the US does strike Iran, what happens next? Dom, why don't you start us off on that?
Yeah, well, that's the big question. I mean, I think, it's all down to what is going on in Donald Trump's mind, which appears to be deeply conflicted. He's gone from telling the Israelis not to get involved, not to strike a few months ago, and the Israelis look like they've been put back in their box, and then the Israelis deciding to do it anyway, and Donald Trump sort of saying, well, actually, I knew about it and it's not that bad an idea, and now saying that the Iranians have to surrender unconditionally. And the impression you kind of get is that he's being led by the nose by Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who will be saying to him now, this is your moment. The Israelis cannot finish off the Iranian nuclear program completely. The sort of the heart of it is buried deep under Fordo Mountain. And to destroy that, they need American bunker-busting bombs, the MOP, Massive Ordnance Penetrator, which can only be delivered, Michael will know more than I do about this, but by, I think, a B-2 stealth bomber that has to be sent from...
I think they tested B-52s as well from my reading around.
They could come from continental United States. They kept it at Whitemore Base in Missouri, so they can operate anywhere in the globe, but it would make more sense to operate from Diego Garcia, which is the only other base the B-2s operate from.
And you were saying yesterday that actually the B-2s have gone back to America.
Yeah, they had 6 of them on Diego Garcia until about a month ago, or 3 weeks ago, and they sent them all back to Whitemore now, so they're all back there. So they could drop an MOP from there. They could take them there. They can operate anywhere on the globe.
Yeah.
But it would make more sense to move them to Diego Garcia. So if we see B-2s appear at Diego Garcia, that would tell us something.
And what the Israelis are saying to the Americans is, look, we've done most of the work.
Yeah.
But if you want to take the glory at the end of this, all you have to do is authorise that mission by a B-2 bomb, because you'll destroy the centrifuges, the enrichment halls under Fordo, and that could also precipitate the end of the Iranian regime. So Donald Trump, I think he's torn between that. That will be tempting because, he's someone who does like to take credit for everything, even if he's nothing to do with it. On the other hand, he's got his party back home, particularly the MAGA wing of the Republican Party, saying, you are the politician who won the election promising to end America's forever wars, to not get involved in faraway conflicts. If you do this, even from the air, you could get sucked into a deeper conflict in the Middle East, which is what you've always said America should not be doing. So I think he's caught on the horns of a dilemma. I think if you were to put money on it, you'd expect him to do something. And I think I think he might be tempted by what the Israelis are saying, simply because it will allow him to claim glory. And also, I think he'll have planners around him saying, you've got to reassert America's deterrence. America lost it after Joe Biden pulled out of Kabul. That caused a huge amount of damage to American prestige, power and deterrence. If it sort of deals the death knell or the final blow to the Iranian regime and its nuclear program, then you could restore it. So it's something that could have an impact beyond the Middle East. Those are the arguments being made to the president, and I suspect he's going to go for it. And then the question is, what do the Iranians do in return?
Yeah, thought from you on
50-50.
Trump.
Yeah, I think it's exactly 50-50. I mean, Mike Huckabee, who's the American ambassador to Israel, sent this post or sent a message to Trump, which Trump then put on his Truth Social. And Huckabee said, you've been placed by God in this position. You are on the verge of greatness, and this is your moment in history. And this sort of messianic vision, which is Netanyahu's vision.
Well, all
this
the
is the
leaders
moment.
have this sort of zeal behind it.
Absolutely, and it's known in America as Christian Zionism. And some of the fundamentalist Christians, they say the second coming of Christ will only happen when the Jews are in Judea. When Judea and Samaria, when the Jews are back in their homeland, only then, says the Bible, will the second coming occur. So that has to happen first. Now, this may sound a bit odd to us in our secular West, but believe me, there's a lot of the MAGA Republicans who are very, very pro-Israel because of their own Christian fundamentalism, Christian Zionism, which goes back to the beginning of the foundation of the U.S. Constitution. And Mike Huckabee, his little message was full of this Christian Zionist message to Trump. This is your moment, Mr. President.
You were saved by God.
That's right. For this.
To do this.
God saved you from assassination for this moment.
On the other hand, you've got Tucker Carlson and people like him saying, No, you were the president who said you're going to end these forever wars. You can't get sucked into another one. So it's a very difficult debate going on there in America for him to be dealing with. But, Trump knows that whatever he does, eventually Republicans fall in behind him.
It will.
So I think it will be tempting for him to...
What I find interesting is that in these debates among the MAGA Republicans, they can't actually have a debate without insulting each other. I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene said those slobbering over the idea of a structure, slobbering. They can't actually have a sensible debate without personal abuse.
They start tearing into each other.
That's who they are.
So look, there's that reason there, that sort of large-scale reason. There's also the fact that this MOP was developed for precisely this fact as well, right? They've never been used in anger.
For something like this.
Something like this, right?
They used something similar in Afghanistan.
Moab.
The Moab, the mother of all bombs.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it's 13 tons, and it can sing, 60 metres through concrete? Before going
Before
on?
exploding on a time.
And the point is, one bomb wouldn't do it. They'd need 3 or 4, and they'd probably have to dig down. So there's a technique with accuracy of dropping another bomb into the crater and then another bomb into that crater.
Okay, so the Israelis do it, though, where they've got 2,000-pound bombs. Could they just drive one in after another?
Maybe. They've got the BLU 109, which they use a lot, and the GBU 28, which they use a lot, and they've tried to dig down in Lebanon, in Beirut, where they've been trying to get to these deep underground things. The problem with Fordo is it's the mountain, so it's not concrete. It's rock and it's variable. So
what about a commando operation?
I was going to ask that.
That's the other thing.
They've got full air superiority, haven't they? Can't they get people there and then do it from the ground?
They would like to.
Okay.
And I bet you they've got contingency plans for it.
So that's that side. If that were to happen, what did the Iranians do in the event that they are struck at Fordo?
Well, I think that's the million-dollar question. I mean, what they're saying, and what they have said before, actually, any of this started, was that if their nuclear program was hit, they wouldn't just strike back at Israel, assuming that Israel was attacking them. They would fire their ballistic missiles all over the place, at American bases in Iraq, but also at American bases and interests and allies in the Persian Gulf. So they kind of threatened to set the Gulf afire, and obviously they haven't done that yet, but that is still a risk, because it's not just a risk for the region, it's a risk for all of us, because a fifth of the world's oil comes through the Persian Gulf. If they close the Straits of Hormuz or turn it into a war zone, that's obviously going to have a dramatic impact fairly quickly on the global economy. But, what they're saying they'll do has kind of been weakened by the fact they haven't done it yet. And they're saying, and we've heard some very fiery rhetoric overnight coming out of Tehran saying that if America gets involved, all bets are off, basically. The gloves will come off and they'll fire their missiles at America. But in return, Trump has said, no, well, if that happens, I'll take my gloves off. And Trump really worries the Iranians because he's totally unpredictable. He killed Qasem Soleimani, one of their key commanders, in a way they just didn't see coming. So for them, he's a totally unpredictable wild card. And I think when he threatens to take the gloves off, that's something that will make them really think twice. So I think it's hard to predict what they will do. I suspect they will try and retaliate in a way that doesn't draw America fully back in, but it's hard to see how you do that. I think what they want to do is draw America into diplomacy. They are much better at diplomacy than the Americans. They see the American team, the Trump team, Witkoff and co, as amateurs, and frankly, a lot of Western diplomats do as well. I mean, I've had the rings run around them by people like Abbas Araghchi, the Iranian foreign minister. So if they can draw them into a diplomatic round again, that's their preference. But I don't think they can do that while the Israelis are still bombing them.
Well, they don't want to talk while they're being attacked, and I guess
and politically, it's very hard for them to do that. They can't compromise with the Americans with a Zionist gun to their head, as
they'll probably they won't give in, I'm sure, but they'll play it long, so that they'll have to tolerate the amount of damage that's being done, maybe to Fordo as well, and they'll vow vengeance, and they'll say all sorts of terrible things, and they'll say, our revenge will take a long time. We don't forget. And the idea is that they'll go in for sort of grumbling guerrilla war tactics as best they can over the next year or 2 years, and that they think may draw the United States into exactly the sort of operations that the US doesn't want to do, Trump doesn't want to do. And so, I mean, if I was in their position with so limited a series of options now, I would actually tolerate the defeat, dress it up as if it's just a tactical problem, and vow vengeance that will be mine over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years.
Vengeance at a time of their choosing. I mean, they don't have their proxies to rely on anymore. So
no, they don't.
Those weapons aren't flying into Israel or to allied bases around the region now. I guess inherent in this question as well is what happens next if they blow up Fordo, if there is an American strike on that nuclear facility. What does that do to the regime's ability to hold on to power? There have been popular movements in Iran that have been quashed over the past, 20 or so years?
I don't think it's all about... For the regime, it's about the nuclear program because they put so much into it. For the people of Iran, it's more about the civilian side and the military and the IRGC's existence. I mean, if that's being dismantled effectively by by the Israelis. That's what undermines the regime. The regime could live with damage, real damage to its nuclear program, and it will tell the population, well, we'll just rebuild it. It's not damaged that badly. We can still do things, and it's true. The knowledge is still there.
Well, I think you've got two things. You've got I think long term, the regime is a busted flush completely ideologically because its whole
the Iranian people feel that as well.
Well,
right?
for a couple of reasons. The whole raison d'etre, their pitch to the Iranian people has been that we've got your backs. We're going to spread the principles of revolution around the Middle East. We're going to protect you from these aggressors. We've always told you you're a threat to Iran, and the way they've promised to do that was with a sort of outer ring of defences, Hamas, Houthis, and particularly Hezbollah, who would be their sort of their initial round of or ring of defence, and they've been defanged and completely emasculated by the Israelis. So that the second kind of protective zone for them was using ballistic missiles and developing this sort of stockpile of fissile material that is a kind of bargaining chip to extract concessions out of the West, but eventually could be used to build a bomb. And that has cost billions. So if you're an Iranian, you've seen your regime, brutally repress an uprising and do terrible things to largely your daughters, wives, mothers, sisters, either on the streets of Iran's cities or in its jails. Then you've seen it spend billions on a defensive strategy that on both those accounts, far away and also back at home, has now gone up in smoke. So there's nothing to make you believe in this regime.
Not working hasn't worked.
Yeah, so I think the motivation amongst the people is that they've got to go or got to be changed dramatically. But this is a regime that effectively is sort of the top, 10, 20% of Iranian society. It's on the payroll. They're either members of the IRGC or the military. If you go there, you're acutely aware there are endless numbers of security agencies controlling what you do. They're on the payroll as well. So there's a whole tranche of, whole elites there, or bunch of elites who see the regime as, if it goes down, they go down with it, and they're not going to want a revolution. But also Iranians see, the Arab Spring, they don't want a violent uprising because they've seen what that's done to the rest of the region. So, if you talk to Iranians, they seem to want more kind of reform. They want the system to change, and one guy said to me, the young people, they look at these old men and they say, we've had it, he said, F you, we say to them, it's done, it's all over, you have lost any right to control us. But it's how they change that's the question. And I suspect the regime's got the cohesive sort of resilience to stay in place for now, but it's under huge pressure to kind of reinvent itself. The Ayatollahs might be toppled, but I think, the military, that whole sort of military-industrial complex that's controlling it, rather like the post-Egyptian revolution, you had the military stepping in. Yeah. So you could see that kind of change. But
perhaps
that's going to be
theocracy.
gradual. It's going to play out over time. Yeah. The Israelis seem to want something more dramatic and quick, and I think they're going to be probably disappointed.
Michael, tie a couple of questions together on that. The first part from sort of C. Kendrick, who would take over? There is no opposition. Who would step in? I mean, Dom suggests the military.
All dictatorships make sure there isn't any obvious succession plan. And Khomeini, we don't know. He's talked about his son, as a possibility, but I don't think that's a very popular idea.
And the thought from you as well, Michael, how close are they to getting a nuclear weapon, really?
They've been on. They're a threshold state, so they've got according to the IAEA, they've got 400 kilos of in uranium enriched to 60%, and that means that in 2 or 3 days at Fordo, if they wanted, they could give themselves enough. They'd need about maybe 20 to 30 kilos of 80%. Because that would give them a crude device. The Hiroshima bomb, actually, the famous Hiroshima bomb, was about 70 kilos of 80% enriched, but it was only 2% efficient because it was a gun trigger mechanism. But if you assume the Iranians could be, say, 10% efficient, with 80%, with, say, 20 to 30 kilos of 80% enriched, 10% efficient, that would give them something like 15 kiloton explode. Give them a Hiroshima-style explosion.
Dom?
Crude.
Seriously close,
so they could do that. But they've got the stuff. Could they trigger it? That's hard. And so they're within a couple of weeks of having enough material, but they're probably about a year away from a triggering mechanism that would work.
It's weaponizing it, isn't it? And I think, Ayatollah Khamenei suspended the weaponization program back in 2003.
Yeah, 2003.
And officially.
Interestingly, no other Western intelligence agency, apart from Israel, to justify this operation, has thought that they have broken out into weaponization yet. In fact, Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence in the States, said back in, I think, March, said they didn't believe they had amassed the biggest amount of fissile material they've ever had, but also did not believe they had gone for that. So I think the Israelis are still going to be under pressure to explain what this intelligence is. In a sense, it's academic because they've begun it already. I think the other key question is, they have the days when you could wipe out a nuclear program by killing a few key nuclear boffins and destroying an enrichment hall are kind of over because they've had it for long enough. They've disseminated the know-how amongst enough nuclear scientists and students so that you could destroy Fordo, you could destroy Natanz. The ability the knowledge on how to do it remains in the minds of those scientists, and you could find another mountain to build an enrichment hall.
So aren't things perhaps hidden in the east of the country as well? Lots of stuff's in the west.
There's a suspicion that the IAEA won't sort of put on paper that they've got more than the 400 kilos that the IAEA know about, and they may have distributed it because you don't need much. You don't need much to actually make a crude weapon. But if you want to make a dozen of them, then you're going to need quite a lot. But if you need enough to make one to frighten everybody to do a test, then you don't need very much.
They haven't done the test yet. The motive to do so because they can say, well, we've come under attack from our Zionist aggressors. We've got to have the bombs. So I think, as you were saying earlier, ultimately you could see the Iranians carry on trying to do it, and the Israelis having to continue to police them and trying to stop them doing so. The only way you sort of guarantee the end of their program is getting rid of the regime, replacing it with a regime that openly declares it doesn't want the.
Well, that kind of speaks to Trump saying he wants ceasefire, more than a ceasefire. He wants the end of it, right?
But, I mean, just on this thing, as a general point, though, Kamali, with nuclear issues, people get very frightened by nuclear weapons, as if, having built a nuclear weapon, it's like having an egg, and you're holding this egg for 100 years. Are you going to drop it at any given moment? The fact is, most nuclear weapons are more likely not to go off than to go off.
That's very interesting.
Right, because the triggering mechanism is so delicate and so difficult. Most nuclear weapons are at least as likely not to work as to work. And in reality, they've been dropped accidentally from aircraft in South Carolina, and they didn't go off. They've been involved in fires. They don't go off. They've been dropped in the sea. They don't go off. I mean, there are all sorts of fail-safe mechanisms as well. But most nuclear devices will tend not to work more than they will work. Doesn't mean to say they're not dangerous, because they could leak and they can catch fire and that sort of thing. But a nuclear explosion is so difficult to organise, to arrange with highly enriched uranium, so difficult to trigger that we shouldn't worry too much about that. Nuclear weapons are actually more robust, actually engineeringly robust than people think.
It's interesting, isn't it?
Reassuring anyway to come out of this.
Yeah, it is. It's interesting as well. The science is still really, really difficult to get something that's
very hard to
nuclear material to weaponize, right?
Yeah. Conversely, the enrichment program or the centrifuges are very delicate and sensitive, so actually you don't need to use too much explosive to put them out of action. No. And the Israelis use cyber espionage to actually destroy centrifuges.
Yeah, the Stuxnet thing.
Virus back in the
there's a series of tens of thousands of spinning drums, and they all have to spin.
Yeah, at the same.
So the gas goes from one drum to the next, to the next, to the next, each time getting a tiny bit more enriched. And any interruption in that process means the whole thing stops. Yeah. It collapses, and you've got to start again.
We're going to rattle through some of these questions because we are running short of time, but the next one actually kind of leads on from that, Michael. It's about Mossad and how far they've infiltrated the Iranian regime. I think there is a fear that there might be a big cyber attack coming, but
for sure.
the Mossad are on the ground in Iran right now.
Realistic fear. Yeah. I mean, during the week, there's been cars blowing up. There's been people assassinations. There are lots of things that are happening which have created a great sense of fear, I think, throughout Iranian society, as far as we can gather.
Michael, how many Mossad agents do you think it would take to assassinate one Iranian commander? I mean, if you guys back in Israel watching it...
Teams.
Well, they work in teams. So they work in teams of 5 to 10. And how many teams would they put on it? But it wouldn't be 2 people who've told go and do it, and it wouldn't be 100 people because that's just too unwieldy. So they work in their teams of 5, 8 or 10.
And they killed 20 commanders on the first night.
Yeah. So
they launched drones from inside Iran, didn't they?
200.
Incredible stuff.
200 agents.
There's a joke that went viral on social media saying that, have you heard the Iranians have hit the Mossad headquarters? No one died. The building's empty because they're all in Iran. There must be thousands of Mossad.
Absolutely. And they've been preparing this for years.
Certainly hundreds in Iran.
And they're not just crossing over like now either. They'll have sleeper cells and stuff in there. Won't they, right?
And the other important thing is, having lived in Israel, I don't think a lot of people know this, but a lot of Israelis obviously come from Iran, and their parents had to leave Iran for various reasons over the sort of the creation of Israel in the years and the wars that followed. And their parents, their grandparents, have proudly Persian, but also Jewish, and they've kept the language alive. So they've taught their children Farsi. So Mossad has had this whole reservoir of Israelis who speak Farsi like Iranians do, who've been able to then go into Iran. I mean, you'd have to be incredibly brave. It must be a very difficult thing to do, very courageous. But you can't. Israelis are very effective at passing themselves off as Iranians because they speak the language.
That's really interesting stuff. All right, we're into the quick fire now, guys. So let's crack through these. Gilbert in Birmingham asks, will the conflict mean there is less support and equipment from Iran to Russia used to fight in Ukraine?
Yes.
It will.
For sure. The Americans diverting stuff now. They're diverting stuff from Ukraine in any case.
This is the other way around. Will that mean that Iran supplies Russia less?
Yeah. But there'll be less American material because they're holding it back in case of something here. So less American material, even in present circumstances for Ukraine. And the Shahid 136 is the drone that everyone thinks about that the Iranians were supplying. But the Russians have now licensed production. They've got the Shahid 238, the Jaran 2 as they call it, and they were producing 300 a month at the beginning of the year. They're ramping that up to 3,000 a month, and they're aiming for 10,000 a month next year. So there won't be a big effect on Iranian supplies to Russia because they've already more or less been licensed production in Russia for the things that they got from Iran originally.
Okay. Dom, question here from Joe Ken. Is there any chance of Britain helping Israel?
I think Britain's going to think very carefully about this. I think there's a possibility. Obviously, we have sent various RAF assets to the region and Royal Naval. There's a possibility that they, I guess, get involved in trying to protect Israel from more missile attacks. And
Israel said something about that at the Rusi conference this week. He referred to that possibility at the Rusi conference. Maybe we might find ourselves wanting to do this, which I thought was rather curious.
I mean, they're running out of interceptors.
Well, this is the point. Reporting now they're low on stock, right?
Yeah, low on stock. So, if there's a deficit there, there's a possibility Britain fills that gap.
Politically, but I think that's quite hard to imagine, isn't it?
I think very
How would you? What would be the reasoning behind it? Protecting an ally against the state sponsor of terrorism? I mean,
but I think there'll be a real queasiness about that in the British government, and there's a lot of concern, I think, amongst Labour MPs as to what Israel's done, why it's done it so preemptively, and has it provided any evidence of? I think the parallels drawn with WMD at the start of the Iraq War. So I think it's difficult. I think Britain is like we're saying about China and Russia and everyone else, like stay out of it. Watch it play out. What Israel's doing, obviously, is meeting British government policy objectives, taking out the Iran nuclear program in a way that Britain hasn't ever wanted to happen. Britain's always preferred a diplomatic solution. But as things play out, it's going to achieve the UK will hope an end that the British want to see. But I don't think they want to.
If Trump hits them,
we've sent Typhoons to Akrotiri, which gives a military option. But you'd be glad to know that the Prince of Wales Carrier Battle Group, which is through the Red Sea, is moving away from the danger zone. As American carriers move towards it, we are processing away.
If Trump was to hit it, how much more does that complicate Britain's response if it were to have to respond in this situation?
Well, it draws us in the sense that we might have to protect our ally, and I think if there were British assets hit in the fallout from an Iranian attack on an American
that's what
base,
the aircraft are there
the
for.
risk.
Yeah, if British
would you respond to an American base being hit? Do you think?
Probably wouldn't need
only
to.
If Brits are involved as well.
But you can see the complication there, right? Because
that's the whole risk. Yeah, that's the risk of expansion and escalation.
If there's a strike at Al Udeid, which is the main American base, we've got 1,000 people there in Doha. The Americans have got 10,000. We've got about 1,000. It's the main air hub for Britain and America in the region.
It's hard to see the Iranians hitting it with a missile, though, isn't it? You assume they'll do something more hybrid out of the waters of the Gulf, but
right. But
the other thing is, if they do try and, a couple of tankers went up in flames yesterday, I think, and that actually turned out to have been a collision. But you'd expect the Iranians to do something that they can kind of deny, so the Americans can't use that as a pretext to attack them. So, if a tanker gets sunk, or there's some kind of mysterious activity that goes out on the Gulf that might involve the Royal Navy coming to its rescue, then you can see the Brits getting involved. And we talk about these things, as we do with all conflicts, in a way that you might be able to predict one thing after another. But there's always the risk of miscalculation, the law of unintended consequences, one thing leading to another. That's the danger here. The more it escalates, the more things could get out of hand.
Let's move on to the final question. It's an important one that people have been asking me for the past couple of days while this conflict has been going on. It's from Bernard. What's happening in Gaza while Israel and Iran fight?
More of the same, unfortunately. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is making a complete mess of the distribution of aid. It's not distributing enough. It looks as if the IDF now are actively involved in the allegation is shooting because these crowds get out of control very quickly. And the Israeli government is now funding gangs, it seems, militias, to operate against Hamas, which is added to the confusion. So you've got gangs, you've got Hamas and the IDF, all periodically firing on desperate people who are not very disciplined because they're grabbing food wherever they can. They're not necessarily, moving to these aid distribution spots in a very careful way. And whenever they see a truck that they think they can hijack, ordinary people just descend on it and hijack the truck.
But it's quite horrendous what's happening, particularly at this roundabout where we've just seen, just terrible numbers of people being killed almost on a daily basis. Seems to happen in the kind of the early hours of the day. And it's, happened again yesterday, I think, sort of around dawn time, Al-Alam roundabout, which is just sort of below the, to go and get your aid as a Palestinian in Gaza, you have to go into a...
And it's only like 300 yards away, isn't it?
Right, it's very close to the... So, yesterday 60 Palestinians reportedly were killed there. 200 were injured. It's hard to see how... And for the first time, the Israelis actually admitted that this had happened, didn't concede the numbers were as much as that. In the past, they've sort of said that they fired warning shots, but clearly were yesterday saying, yes, that there was some kind of gunfire that did lead to people dying. But they need to justify, it's not crowd control, it's not what they call suspects leaving the road. Something more sinister seems to be happening. To kill that number of people and injure so many others, and the Israelis have not explained why. And they are insisting with this aid programme, which, as Michael says, is just disastrous. It's not delivering enough aid, and it's leading to a lot of people dying.
It's gone about as badly as we could have imagined it would go when we were a bit sceptical about it. Well, very sceptical.
The person they put in charge quit before it even started, knowing that it wasn't going to work.
We said this is a disaster waiting to happen, and it's been as bad as we thought it might get.
So the accountability for that before the Iran war broke out was difficult to get from the Israelis because of the reasons that were given as to why this was happening. Now, at this point, global outrage is not really going to make any difference.
There is a bandwidth, isn't there, for any government or for the media as well. So the focus is on this war happening over Iran. But it's important to point out that before this happened, France was possibly on the verge this week of recognising Palestine, with Saudi Arabia doing so as well, and encouraged by the Saudis.
And what happened?
The British sanctioned 2 members of the Israeli government for the first time. Things were moving very much against Israel diplomatically. It was being more and more ostracised. Now, this has taken the pressure off that, but we have to still remember what's happening in Gaza and the fact the Israelis are waging a war there that is increasingly criticised, is increasingly leading to what appear to be war crimes, or certainly are alleged to be war crimes, that number of civilians dying. And there's a huge amount of pressure on Israel to justify what it's doing, explain what's happening, but also from its allies to end this war, which just seems to be achieving very little and causing huge amounts of civilians to die and suffer.
But one thing that the Israelis will be looking at is, beneath all of this disorder and the killing, they'll be doing a lot of metrics to say how far is this aid arrangement pulling people to the south, which is where they want them. To what have they got a bigger proportion of the Gazan population now hanging around in the southwest corner of Gaza, which is where they want them to be. They want to pull people out of the north into the south and into one corner of the south, about 10% of the territory, of a very small territory in the first place.
So by their own kind of metric, is it delivering?
Regardless of the killing, is it actually pulling people into the area where we want them to be and we want them to stay? Because they're going to create a sort of, it looks as if they want to create a sort of ghetto and push most of the 2 million people into that one corner of Gaza and then redevelop the rest of it themselves. I don't think that's a coherent plan, but that seems to be part of what prominent members of the Israeli government say they want to do, and Netanyahu never commits himself as to what he really wants to do, other than a continuation of the hostilities.
And also, it's the G word, isn't it? It's genocide, and an increasing number of countries, governments, and organisations are accusing the Israelis of genocide, and the British government coming as close as it's ever been to saying it believes that is possible. That's a very difficult place for the Israelis to be in.
Jonathan Sumption had a great phrase on this. Ex-Supreme Court judge, very, very respected member. And he said a couple of weeks ago, a very important interview, he said, what the IDF is doing, and this is, I have to say, is exactly my view. What the IDF is doing is not genocide. It doesn't meet that threshold. But my goodness, they're getting close.
Right.
So thank you for Bernard for bringing it up, because
Yeah.
it is really important
We
that we remain as focused
Yeah.
on Gaza as we do on what's happening in the rest of the Middle East.
Well, thank you to Bernard. Thank you to you, Dom. Thank you to you, Michael, of course, as always, for answering our questions. And thank you all for watching and for submitting your questions. I think we're going to have to do another one of these pretty soon. So do join us again for that when you can. Thanks for being with us.